Number 4, Polaris. The North Pole star Polaris is one of the best pieces of evidence against the HelioCentric theory, as it is observable from anywhere north of the equator, and it has been documented as far south as the Tropic of Capricorn. Now, astronomers claim that the North Pole star changes over thousands of years, although there is no physical or historical evidence for that at all. In fact, there is actually astronomical evidence, clear evidence, to show the very contrary in the form of the precession of the Equinoxes. Now, this alleged 26,000 year cycle was supposedly discovered about 2,000 years ago by Hipparchus, who was a Greek astronomer. He noticed that the sun would always rise in front of a specific constellation during the equinox, although there is a very slow precession occurring over very long periods of time, about 26,000 years for one complete cycle of the equinoxes. And of course, Hipparchus didn't see this 26,000 year cycle. He merely noticed like a 1 degree change in this over his entire life. Now, for the last 2,000 years or so, we were said to be in the age of Pisces. I'm a Pisces. But no, we were said to be in the age of the Pisces based on this precession of the equinoxes, and we're now just sort of entering into the age of Aquarius, which really all that means is that the sun is going to rise in front of the constellation of Aquarius during the vernal equinox for the next 2,000 years or so, until it slowly phases on to the next zodiac sign. Now, it's claimed by theorists that the precession of the equinoxes is caused by something called axial precession, a fancy schmancy term for the Earth wobbling on its axis. They claim that while the Earth rotates on an axis tilted at 66.6 degrees from the ecliptic plane, that axis is slowly wobbling, or axially precessing, at about 1 degree every 72 years, completing one single wobble over a 26,000 year period. This theory involving axial precession is interesting and ingenious indeed. However, the biggest problem is observable reality categorically conflicts with the theory. If the axis of the Earth was indeed precessing along a large circular wobble, 1 degree per 72 years, the most obvious indicator of this axial precession would be the star or the point in space aligned to the axis. In truth, the North Pole star is almost perfectly aligned with our alleged axis of rotation, making a very minute circuit over the course of a day. You can focus a telescope in the general direction of Polaris, and you will not need to readjust the alignment of your telescope to keep Polaris in the viewfinder. Night after night, season after season, year after year, for all of recorded history, Polaris has always been right there in that point. Now, if the Earth was indeed rotating and its axis was experiencing this long-term precession as claimed, the point in space aligned to the North Polar axis would be under constant flux. Although this change would be extremely slow in human terms, it would be obvious over the course of a few decades that the North Pole star is becoming misaligned to the North Polar axis. 1 degree of alleged axial precession every 72 years, or a half a degree over the course of 36 years. Now, on the other hand, the least obvious indicators of such an alleged axial precession would be the equatorial stars, or the stars, far away from the central axis, for obvious reasons. It literally took 2 lifetimes of very smart and meticulous observers, astronomers. Again, that was Hipparchus and Ptolemy. Took them 2 consecutive lifetimes of documentation and observation, apparently, to discover just 2 degrees of the precession of the equinoxes. Now, such astute and professional astronomers would surely have noticed the North Pole star misaligning from the central position amongst all the other stars, far more obviously than the equatorial constellations precessing 1 degree every 72 years, as only observed on the equinox. The closer the star is to the central position in alignment with the axis of the Earth, the more obvious axial precession would be, according to an observer focused on that star. We can safely assert with 100% certainty that the precession of the equinoxes couldn't possibly be caused by the Earth rotating and its axis precessing. So, in other words, the precession of the equinoxes couldn't be caused by axial precession of the Earth. And so there must be some other explanation for the slow regression in the background stars which host the rising sun during the vernal equinox. Apparently, there is indeed a long-term regression sequence occurring in the zodiacal constellations, resulting in the practically unnoticeable precession of the equinoxes, yet it takes an entire lifetime of meticulous observation and documentation, only once per year, over many, many, many years, to notice even a fraction of a degree in terms of precession of the equatorial stars located in the position where the sun will rise during the vernal equinox. If Polaris remains fixed in the same point for the duration of the documented history, for many hundreds of years, even thousands of years, the theory involving axial precession being causal of the precession of the equinoxes falls flat on its face. Now, there must be some cause for the entire set of stars to apparently wobble or precess very slowly once per 26,000 years. Apparently, while the North Pole star Polaris remains fixed above the central position for the duration. Now, one way to visualize this from a geocentric flat Earth perspective is that the stars, whatever they are all apparently encircling Polaris once per day, more or less fixed to a similar plane. We can call it the astronomical plane or the astral plane for short. Due to the nature of our atmosphere as well as the nature of our eyes, the most distant visible stars appear to rest just above the horizon, nearly touching the horizon, it would appear. Now, this is, of course, an optical illusion and is an operation of perspective as well as atmospheric lensing, and the stars, including the sun or even the moon, the objects that appear, the celestial objects that appear near the horizon, are actually upon more or less the same plane as the stars directly overhead. Any notion of a celestial dome or a celestial sphere is the result of misinterpreting the information gathered by our eyes, decoded by our minds, improperly. Now, the stars, the sun, and the moon never actually come close to the ground in reality. They merely appear to meet with the horizon or come close to, and then often disappear beyond our optical vanishing point or seem to go beneath the ground horizon, which, of course, the ground horizon is a physical obstruction to our line of sight at a given distance. Now, due to the lateral distance gained from the observer, as well as the exacerbation of the steep angles describing the apparent paths of celestial lights by the atmosphere itself. So, in other words, the atmosphere behaves as sort of a giant lens around us, which exacerbates the perspective effect, or the dropping of apparent vertical descent of stars or celestial objects as they gain lateral distance away from us. They aren't actually going towards the ground. It appears that way due to perspective, and it is exacerbated by the liquid medium that we're surrounded in, which behaves sort of as a very large, giant, subjective atmospheric dome above and around each of us individually. I'm not talking about an actual dome above the entire world. What I mean is we exist within a fluid atmosphere which behaves as a lens on the macroscopic level. This lensing effect of the atmosphere exacerbates the operation of perspective when, observing celestial lights, which are far higher in altitude than the ground is below your feet. So in other words, if you're 6 feet tall, then the ground is 6 feet beneath you. And so you can only see across the ground due to your angle, your line of sight, for about 3.5 miles, assuming you're looking out at a flat body of water. The sky, on the other hand, is far higher than 6 feet, and is not a hard barrier, physical obstruction to your line of sight. And so the laws of perspective apply a little bit differently to the celestial objects than they do to objects on the ground. So, for example, if you're standing on a set of railroad tracks, the laws of perspective apply to that, where the railroad tracks appear to disappear off to a point at the vanishing point or at the horizon. However, say a star is 3,000 miles above your head, just hypothetically throwing a number out there. Say that star is 3,000 miles above your head. Well, if it travels away 3.5 miles, it's not gonna, vanish off to a point. That star is gonna have to travel quite a distance away from you before it begins to apparently drop towards the horizon. And that star will appear, if the conditions are right, to be right above that vanishing point where the railroad tracks meet, but you're dealing with two completely different planes. You're dealing with a plane below you that is only 6 feet below you, that is a physical obstruction to your line of sight, and you're dealing with the astral plane, which is thousands of miles overhead, which is not going to obstruct your line of sight. And so this does give the illusion to a celestial dome or a celestial sphere, especially with the whole atmospheric lensing phenomenon in play, which is a real thing. That's not some made-up theory. The atmosphere does all sorts of crazy things to light. Maybe I'll show a couple of examples so that you understand what I mean. Rainbows would be a good example. Inversions would be a good example. And experiments can be done with water to show how atmosphere can do similar things. Because again, gases and atmosphere in the troposphere behave very similar to a liquid on the macroscopic level, of course. Sometimes it can be difficult for us to contemplate the extent to which our eyes and environment can deceive us, but I'll give a couple of practical examples which should help me to make the point clear. Observable stars truly have no scientific explanation whatsoever. They really don't. We're told that the stars are the result of gravity and hot atomic fusion, ultimately the result of the Big Bang. But you've got hot atomic fusion going on inside these stars, even the sun. Now, both of these, all of these, the Big Bang, gravity, and hot atomic fusion, are theoretical fantasies completely divorced from demonstrable reality. Gravity remains an unproven theory, despite what LIGO lies about, exactly as hot atomic fusion remains an unproven theory. For more information on the fallacy of star and planet formation, check out my recent video, Which Came First, Gravity or the Sphere? Or another one that I would suggest would be Flat Earth, Deception in Natural Energy. I'll put cards and links and end screen options for you guys for your convenience. Check those out at your leisure. Now, according to all accounts, the North Pole star Polaris, whatever it is, has always been central to all the other stars in the exact same place for the entire time. However, due to the known observations involved with the precession of the equinoxes, we should have seen a veritable conga line of north stars, over the years, which would be aligned to our hypothetical axis of rotation, going through this 26,000 year wobble. We should have a constantly ever-changing North Star, especially over thousands of years. But since the time of Hipparchus and Ptolemy first discovering the cycle of the precession of the equinoxes, which has never been confirmed, by the way, in terms of that cycle, because frankly people haven't been studying astronomy for 26,000 years, so it is a sort of best guess extrapolation. But it appears that according to known history, people have been studying precession of the equinoxes for about 2,000 years, or about 7.5% of the total alleged cycle. Now, it truly is impossible to say what unknown variables may occur within 5 or 10,000 years into this cycle. Just as sort of an analogy or an example, if you were to study the path of the sun for only a month or two, you'd probably never guess that the analemma would occur. You would need to patiently document the sun for an entire year to notice the analemma cycle, and then confirm over a whole nother year that the cycle of the analemma is indeed a repeating phenomenon. So in terms of precession of the equinoxes, a civilization, many generations of people, would need to dedicate over 26,000 years of observation just to the first cycle of the precession of the equinoxes, one single time, and subsequently to confirm it's a repeating cycle, they would need to spend another 26,000 years to ensure that, it's a repeating cycle. For a more in-depth look at the precession of the equinoxes, check out my video, Flat Earth, Precession of the Equinoxes. I'll put a card right up here and put a link down in the scripts. Although a mere 7.5% completion of a single cycle of precession over about 2,000 years wouldn't amount to a grandiose change in terms of the background stars above the rising sun during the vernal equinox, however, we're apparently entering into the age of Aquarius, as it were, so there has been some long-term slow change over the last 2,000 years. Now, during this time, during the last 2,000 years, as we went through Pisces to Aquarius, the axis of rotation should have precessed a staggering 27 degrees through its alleged wobble, which should have resulted in our axis to change its alignment dramatically since the time of Hipparchus and Ptolemy, yet no documented changes in the North Polar alignment to Polaris can be found to match this alleged axial precession or Earth wobble, which does not exist, folks, period. This makes it perfectly clear why Ptolemy would never have considered a situation where the Earth is spinning and the stars are essentially stationary, as the point in space above the North Polar axis would be the most obvious indicator of any changes in the alignment of a hypothetical geological axis of rotation, Instead of the Earth spinning upon a tilted, wobbly axis, it appears as if the astral plane itself is rotating once per day, experience a slow cycle wobble over the course of about 26,000 years, thus providing a viable alternative to explain the same observations and data which were historically interpreted erroneously in terms of the axial precession theory, ultimately culminating in the absurd concoction of geological axial rotation, geological axial precession, orbital motion, solar frame of reference, galactic frame of reference, etc., despite the perfectly stationary North Pole star Polaris, which has remained aligned to the alleged axis of rotation for all of recorded history, completely eliminating any possibility of axial precession, period. The heliocentric model doesn't match observable reality because it quite simply is all sorts of bullshit and utterly incorrect at every pillar, every point, every post, from Earth curvature to axial rotation, axial precession, orbital motion, orbital mechanics, the theory of gravity, the theory of space-time, NASA's forgeries, and the infinitely obsolete technologies available to the ancient minds who allegedly fabricated the notion that the world is a spinning ball and incrementally convinced everyone to force all generations of toddlers into concretely believing absurd science fiction fantasy is proven scientific fact. On the other hand, this cult of scientism labels anyone who questions the accepted scientific narrative as anti-scientific, scientifically illiterate, and anti-progress, or, of course, my personal favorite, a stupid moron, which is very original, but such angst and such negative rhetoric prevents the truth from ever finding its way into the halls or the minds of the worldwide Church of Scientism. Indeed, the world has never been unified into a singular, seamless, allegedly fallible religion until the last few decades or so. Every corner of the world is now completely allied with the cult of scientism, with very few exceptions, largely thanks to the advances in communications, technology, and a worldwide industrial revolution, complete with airports in every country, high-speed rails. All sorts of technologies have sort of made the world a lot smaller, although many different countries throughout the world seem to be enemies on the surface, or at least display sort of political hostility or political differences. The scientific community seems to be generally immune or uninhibited by political tensions, wars, or hardened militarized borders. The same theoretical astrophysics that is preached from the babbling parrots in the classrooms in America are being preached in exactly the same way in China, Japan, Russia, Africa, India, South America, Israel, Saudi Arabia, just to name a few. They're all teaching the heliocentric model. Although every one of those countries or continents wildly vary in terms of the majority religious makeup of their citizenry, from Buddhist to Hindu to Christianity to Muslim or Jewish, or Islam, Muslim, whatever. The religion of scientism trumps any religious beliefs or spiritual truths and becomes the actual lens through which people view the world, ourselves, and the universe. And although atheism and scientism do not self-identify as religions, they are actually indeed 100% religions, complete with religious dogmas and unquestionable premises, hierarchical pontificates, and of course fanaticism, zealotry, ostracizing disbelievers, contradictions, and the labeling as heretic anyone who disagrees with the scientism model of the day. This is a very unique time in history, essentially unprecedented, as even just 100 years ago, the large variety of ancient cultures and empires had scientifically described cosmologies, most of which were indeed geocentric, including the Vedic traditions, Chinese astronomy, Greek astronomers like Ptolemy, Indian astronomers like Aryabhata, none of whom based their philosophical beliefs on the idea that the universe is some chaotic random result of a godless, soulless, pointless, endless universe birthed from a big bang, and all of them knew that the earth was a stationary plane and the heavenly luminaries were merely lights in the night sky. The religion of scientism has its origins in the 1500s, really, during the Copernican revolution, although the philosophers of ancient Greece are often alleged to have theorized a spherical Earth and varying sorts of relationships with the sun. However, the entire civilized world and beyond became inundated with the know-it-all pseudoscience from globe Earth proponents in the decades following Columbus's infamous misadventure to the Bahamas while in search for India, which is why people still to this day call Native Americans Indians. In any case, cartographers eventually realized that the landmass west of Europe and east of China is an entirely different place that is actually quite enormous, consisting of, well, Alaska, Canada, North America, Central America, South America, really quite a large place. Now, such a massive area being unknown to the entire world prior to the late 1400s is quite astounding, and it does bring up a good point. Not only was the globe strictly in the realm of theory, but it was also not widely accepted. Although it may have been postulated by ancient Greeks, it was not widely accepted by any means until after, well, the first globes were made in the late 1400s, early 1500s. So the globe head argument that everyone knew the Earth was a globe for 2,000, or some of them even say 3,000 years, which I'm not sure where they're getting those numbers, but even 2,000 years, there may have been some Greek philosophers that were postulating and kicking this idea around a bit in their little world. However, to claim that it was some sort of a well-known thing across the world for thousands of years is one of the most preposterous arguments coming from Team HelioCentric. Furthermore, navigators and cartographers were able to make maps that worked while totally missing the United States or the American continents altogether. And so this just goes to show that cartographers can make maps that work even if they have a totally fallacious model of the world. It proves that plain as day. So after the circumnavigation of the Earth was confirmed, the gullible scientific community, prone to illogical leaps of faith and confirmation bias, eventually dubbing circumnavigation as unquestionable proof of the Earth's sphericity, which was parroted by the highly esteemed scientific minds of the time, coupled with the typical pageantry associated with the likes of Royal Astronomical Clubs, all of whom tout themselves as genius by the implications of their rather poor and misguided interpretations of data and confirmation bias, yet cloaking their idiocracy in complex mathematics and long, complex words. Now, as usual, the majority of people were duped by manipulative propaganda, putting their trust and faith in other men to tell the truth, even in the name of science. People trusted them, and they were duped by this manipulative propaganda, as well as the confirmation bias, as well as predictive programming, presumably, the degree to which one can really only imagine. For your information, this is a tangent alert, as we're about to go off on a bit of a tangent, but I promise I'll bring it right back to how scientists are led by the nose according to the opinions of highly esteemed experts, which is a process that starts by convincing each scientist that they themselves pretty much know everything, especially in terms of the HelioCentric model and hypothetical astrophysics, although they really know diddly squat in truth. Now, people come along who claim to know everything like all the other lientists, but they have some new complex theory about everything where the mathematics is so complex, only a few people in the world claim to be able to understand it, and then you have revolution in lions. And a good example of this would be Albert Einstein and his theories of relativity. He was a patsy, a puppet, who took credit for the ideas and concepts of others before him, and crafted a complex set of theories which involve such an abstract concept it's barely worth mentioning, truly. I'm not going to get into gravity here, but check out my playlist, The Fallacy of Gravity, for more information on why the idea of space-time and gravity are so ridiculous, yet such laughable and preposterous ideas were paraded around the world stage and scientific community as if some big mystery had been solved with relativity and other concepts such as E equals mc squared, which is one of the most ridiculous things Einstein ever came up with. That is, of course, because E equal mc squared is a equation which will never be demonstrated. It literally means energy, or it equates energy to mass accelerated at the speed of light squared. So it's physically impossible. It's never going to happen, not in a million billion years. It's theoretical nonsense. In truth, Einstein was the mouthpiece for a tricky, wily group of Freemasonic, Jesuit, Talmudic, basically anti-human shills who needed to push a narrative to confound the scientific community, as all physical tests done by credible conventional scientists were concluding null results in terms of the Earth's movement, rotation, and orbit and such. All physical tests done by credible conventional scientists were concluding that the Earth was stationary. So this was not conducive to the scientific narrative, and something had to be done. So Einstein's theories of relativity, special relativity, general relativity, especially do away with, a lot of Newton's laws and logic. But they also do away with logical, demonstrable reality. They sort of defy the capability of human understanding in many cases, and the claims that the speed of light is invariable while time is variable is one of the most absurd claims that Einstein ever made. Now, of course, I do realize that the first argument that's going to come out is, well, what about time dilation? And what about Einstein's predictions of time dilation? However, let's just say hypothetically, Einstein or the astronomical society and scientific bodies that backed him already knew about the phenomenon of time dilation, assuming such a thing occurs at high velocities, which, by the way, pilots do not account for time dilation. But even assuming that such a thing does indeed occur at high velocities, it doesn't prove that it's due to gravitational fields. It could have to do with electromagnetic fields just as easily. The point being is, if you know that a phenomenon is going to occur, whether it's time dilation under certain circumstances or the so-called gravitational lensing or the apparent movement of stars behind the sun during solar eclipses, and framing such things that you already know the outcome to as predictions of your theory is, well, it's pseudoscience and it's also fraud. And that's probably the most likely scenario, as there are a number of natural conditions that could cause the so-called gravitational lensing and time dilation, but again, they were framed as proofs. So time dilation is another one of these instances where scientists may have crafted a self-fulfilling prophecy to look like a prediction in order to provide experimental evidence for a theory. And again, Einstein predicted time dilation, and lo and behold, they allegedly came up with experimental evidence for time dilation. Yet again, it has no bearing whatsoever in standard aviation, although it is claimed to be a fundamental necessity for satellite navigation, which is really quite preposterous. And again, even if such a thing does occur for super high altitude flights in terms of time dilation, and I've covered this in greater detail in a recent video, I'll put a card right here to that video. But again, even assuming such a thing does occur during super high velocity, high altitude flights, it doesn't necessarily confirm Einstein's theories because it could have nothing to do with gravity whatsoever, if indeed such a thing occurs. There are many different variables that it could have to do with, and since we're pretty much all figuring out that we live in an electromagnetic universe and gravity doesn't exist, then if such a thing as time dilation does occur at super high velocities, then it would necessarily be an electromagnetic phenomenon as opposed to a gravitational phenomenon. The claims that the speed of light is invariable while time is variable is one of the most absurd claims that Einstein ever made, probably second only to E equals mc squared. Furthermore, the vacuum of space is comprised of space-time, which is an intermeshed fabric of physical empty space and theoretical, mathematical, non-physical concept of time. So space-time would sort of be akin to, like, I don't know, objects made out of numbers. So, like, let's say you have an object, and somebody asks you, well, what is that object made out of? And you say, well, it's made out of numbers. And you're like, what do you mean, code? No, it's made out of this spoon here is made out of numbers. It's not code, and there is a spoon, but it is a number spoon, because of course numbers are theoretical placeholders, constructs of the human mind. They don't actually exist in physical reality. We use them to quantify things and describe reality. And you can have complex applications of numbers in mathematics, but you simply can't have a spoon, a physical object, made out of hypothetical placeholders. And similarly, the alleged vacuum or void of space-time, or void of space, can't be made out of time, or can't be intermeshed with time, if I'm making any sense with my spoon analogy here. And no, you can't say there is no spoon. As much as I use matrix analogies, there is a spoon. It's made out of lots of little numbers, hypothetical numbers that only exist in my mind. Pretty much the same thing as claiming that the vacuum of space, if even such a thing exists, is comprised of time as well as physical space. It's ridiculous nonsense that was necessary in order to do away with the ether because of physical experiments like Airy's failure, Michelson-Morley. But that's a whole nother topic. Just to understand that space-time and E equals mc squared, according to me, are a load of bull. Do you guys know the old saying, the bigger the lie, the more people will believe it? Whomever said that was spot on when it comes to Einstein, as the amount of sheer illogical skullduggery involved with relativity and the theory of space-time and gravity, according to Einstein, are so far beyond ridiculous, it's really no wonder so many people believed it. I mean, if you adhere to that old saying, the bigger the lie, the more people will believe it. Especially since Einstein had the 100% backing of the mainstream media machine and the world governments, who are, of course, run by a shadow group well above any single government official or national boundaries. Honestly, all it takes is a handful of highly esteemed, highly renowned scientists to agree with Einstein's theories and claim that they have checked the math and it works, and suddenly you have this sort of fabricated consensus among the proclaimed brightest minds of the time when you're dealing with concepts strictly in the realm of theory, beyond the form of any sort of demonstration in terms of E equals mc squared or space-time or gravity. If a group of influential scientists jump on board with a given theory, and the mainstream media jumps on board with them, and the government backs these guys and starts throwing money at scientists who research this sort of thing, the whole thing is proclaimed as a major scientific breakthrough. The scientific community will absolutely follow the money. And they will also follow their far more prestigious and highly renowned colleagues, at least for a time. And I think that time is about up, at least in terms of Einstein. The era of Einstein is coming to a close. Just most people don't know it yet. Now, if you think that this same sort of thing doesn't apply to modern times, then you're sadly mistaken, as anything purported by NASA or the other so-called national space agencies or private space agencies, anything that they claim or assert is blindly and unquestionably accepted by the masses as absolute truth. This is the case for laymen and scientists alike, as NASA is such an integral part of American culture, and world culture indeed. It has captured the imaginations of huge cross-sections of the world and the world culture. So, to claim that the scientific community of Einstein's era possessed, some higher discernment to have seen beyond the Ivy League pontificates of scientism, who are all professing their gobbledygook globism mathematical hypotheticals. Scientists are so eager to achieve government funding and notoriety. It's not just a herd mentality going on here, which allures scientists into such fruitless efforts as searching for gravity waves or...
Ladies and gentlemen, we have convinced ourselves we have detected gravitational waves. So I'm going to show you two videos that are going to sort of tell you what we discovered. So the first video, by the way, this is not a Hollywood production that I'm going to show you. It is actually a real computer simulation, a real computer simulation, a real computer simulation, a real computer simulation. All right, now, let me talk about the gravitational waves. You didn't see any gravitational waves there. What you saw was actually black holes. Now let me look at this from the gravitational wave perspective. So you're going to see, again, a computer simulation. This is a real simulation, a real simulation, a real simulation, a real simulation.
Searching for, gravity's theoretical evil twin, dark matter, or, trying to get a job as an astronaut, working with NASA. All of this stuff is a big waste of time. However, if there's prestige, notoriety, and money involved in it for scientists, then they will be drawn to that. Now, if the government decides to dump our tax dollars into funding NASA and LIGO and other such programs, then scientists will obviously follow the money. But more importantly, they'll follow the herd, or follow the narrative deemed proper by the benefactors, or they'll follow the exit sign. Giving the majority of the employees of NASA and other such scientific entities the benefit of the doubt, I would say that most of them probably have no clue as to the deception involved with NASA and the flat stationary Earth. Even if a NASA employee figures out somehow that the Earth is flat and NASA is a pack of liars, they've been faking space and pretending to probe the universe and Uranus. If someone at NASA did actually figure it out, do you think they'd actually tell anyone at work? Could you imagine that conversation? I'm not even going to try to do it. But if they were to figure this out and talk about it, people would instantly think they were insane, even if they provided conclusive, repeatable proof that the Earth was flat and stationary and that NASA was lying. This sort of rule of being ridiculed and deemed insane applies especially if you work for NASA or some, government-funded scientific institution. If a NASA scientist or employee or subcontractor were to somehow figure out the truth and muster the personal integrity to march up to the podium at a press conference and proceed to profess that NASA has been faking space exploration since day one and the Earth is actually a stationary plane, not only would everyone think that person is crazy, but they also wouldn't believe them anyway, and they'd lose their job at NASA before they could finish explaining the perspective upon a plane. So, it would be a silly thing to do even if a person at NASA figured it out. They simply wouldn't talk about it. So it's very safe to assume with near certainty that the key players in the know at NASA and other such pseudo-scientific lie factories, such people are very few and far between in number, and they probably hold top positions where they control the purview and the latitude of operation for the compartmentalized employees lower on the pyramid, so to speak. This sort of matrix comes directly from Freemasonry, and it's actually how all modern power structures are designed, from the military to corporations to law enforcement, educational systems, government agencies, etc., etc. At the lower levels of the pyramid, the agents or the associates or the initiates or the neophytes are sworn to carry out the orders of their superiors without asking questions, without a clue regarding the big picture or overall goals of the institution they are being assimilated into. Such initiates at the bottom of the pyramid are only privy to certain portions of information that is critical to their limited function alone. Now, at the top level of the pyramid, and of course we're skipping a few rungs here for brevity's sake, as we can all understand the concept of, employees, shift leaders, bosses, general managers, regional managers, etc. Or in terms of the military, you've got corporals, sergeants, colonels, generals, etc. But at the top level, it seems that you'll find a small group of people who appear to be interconnected as sort of a central hub for all of these pyramids of power, as it were. And this central hub sort of has revolving doors, and they're interconnected, and it really appears that they're connected through secretive brotherhoods, Freemasonic organizations, and such. This is the case for all spheres or pyramids of power and influence in the world. So, for example, although the government, the media, and large corporations seem to be completely separate entities to the general public, at the very top levels you have... Oh, and did I mention churches in there? Yeah, churches, especially hierarchical churches, are run this way as well. You know, you've got the Pope, the cardinals, the da-da-da-da-da. So, yeah, they're all run like giant pyramid schemes. That's why the Illuminati love the pyramid. It's the whole model of their power structure. So even though the government, the media, and these large corporations seem to be completely separate entities to the general public, on the bottom levels or on the surface, at the very top levels, you really seem to have a very small group of extremely rich and powerful and interconnected people calling the shots, dictating orders from the top down. This allows them to manipulate vast numbers of people all over the world through all cross sections of life, including everyone in the military, because they all say yes sir, yes ma'am, and carry out their orders, including the mainstream media, where even the most famous reporters say yes sir and read the teleprompter even if they disagree with it or they get fired. The entire educational system, because even if a teacher disagrees with the federal curriculum, they must say yes sir and teach what the federal curriculum is. The entire banking system, because even though the Federal Reserve Bank is not federal and holds no reserves, nor does it hold the constitutional privilege to print and issue our currency, nor regulate the value thereof, people at the FDIC banks say yes sir, and they loan out money like crazy and create wealth out of thin air, thus creating a situation conducive to hyperinflation, which is why, since the Federal Reserve was implemented, we've seen the US dollar lose essentially all of its value, pretty much. Furthermore, this goes on to the ultimate path of science. As we all know, scientists go where the money flows, and you have sort of a hierarchy of science as well. And that goes in part with education, but, you know, you've got sort of gods of science, and then you've got regular scientists doing a great job who just aren't in on the scam, it would appear. That's just my personal opinion, but scientists certainly do go where the money is, and the government makes sure that the money is in places where science ain't gonna do shit. Like space exploration, never gonna happen because space doesn't exist. CERN, you're never gonna create a Einstein-Rosen bridge because gravity doesn't exist. You're never going to create the conditions similar to the conditions moments after the Big Bang because the Big Bang never happened. So, you know, NASA, CERN, you know, LIGO, these types of places, like LIGO's never going to find gravity waves because gravity doesn't exist. But there's money in that. And so that's where the brightest minds in science are going to go. And this is very clever of the government because it prevents our brightest minds and our most dedicated scientists from discovering the truth. Which is a very simple truth. And I realize it's difficult for people to understand. What's the motive? Why would they lie about the shape of the Earth? I would just point you to my video, Earth Not a Globe 3, The Motive, or you can watch the whole series. This whole pyramidal power structure ensures that the entire world can be manipulated by a handful of people at the top of such corporate sort of structured pyramids of power who dictate the orders through a chain of command, and the only acceptable response from personnel below the order giver is yes sir or yes ma'am. You know, as they say, it rolls downhill, so the compartmentalization and rigid chain of command provides a climate antithetical to the scientific process especially. and also allows for psychopathic members of secretive orders to slowly implement themselves into the top positions of all sectors of power and influence. Now, this may sound like some bizarre conspiracy theory that I've cooked up in my brain that could never happen, but unfortunately, it's very much true and it's already happened. We've been living in such tyranny our entire lives, although we'd never know it because we're brainwashed into thinking we're all sorts of free here in America, which we absolutely are not. Although the situation has become really infinitely worse since the beginning of the 21st century, so in the last 17 years, mainly because of the advent of 9/11 and the US government's never-ending war on terrorism, which is exactly what PNAC wanted prior to their entrance into the White House, but I digress. Now, this whole corporate-style system of governance inhibits progress, especially in the realm of science, as teams of intelligent, educated people who specialize in different aspects of a sort of project will tend to work more effectively and efficiently when they can behave as a single, transparent, coherent unit in constant communication, sharing ideas, sharing findings freely. And frankly, it's hard to understand how entities like NASA get anything accomplished, as the majority of their people are working sort of in the dark in terms of what their associates in the cubicle over are doing. The very nature of the structure of NASA's workforce eliminates the chances of a person realizing the truth about flat Earth. And of course, they would never dare utter a word of it should they ever realize the truth about it. It would be career suicide and possible actual non-consensual assisted suicide courtesy of the US government. Even if they did bring up flat Earth to their colleagues or to their superiors, which would be a silly thing to do, nobody would believe them, and they would at least lose their job, possibly become institutionalized, and their job consists of getting paid pretty damn well for doing pretty much nothing, tinkering around with computers and gadgets. And so I don't see too many people at NASA who do figure this out, rocking the boat, so to speak. Now, our technological infrastructure, which should be a national civilian resource and a benefit to everyone, has been craftily stolen right out from under us and sold back to us at millions of times what it was originally worth. And by the way, did I mention we paid for it to begin with to be built? Yeah, that was stolen right out from under us, and this infrastructure consists of innumerable radio frequency towers used for RF triangulation for decades prior to the claim of satellites, presumably complemented by a vast array of geostationary weather balloons, anywhere from up to around 150,000 feet in altitude, maybe more, maybe less. Such an array of high-altitude balloons could behave as signal repeaters. And let's not forget, more recently with high-speed internet all over the world, we have super high bandwidth fiber optic cables running all over the world, through every ocean, connecting all modernized countries and continents with a literal fiber optic web of data cables. Now, this combination of communications infrastructure, again, this would be radio towers, data cables, and possibly high altitude weather balloons. This infrastructure is far more practical, far more affordable, and far more logical and possible than the idea of satellites, which do not even exist in reality. Now, satellites are claimed to be hundreds or even thousands of miles away from the Earth's surface. In truth, we do not need satellites flying through this theory of space-time to achieve GPS or worldwide communication systems or other technologies which are often falsely associated with satellites. For another example would be like Doppler radar for weather prediction and satellite TV. Since it's allegedly so difficult and dangerous to launch billion-dollar rockets into space, which then deploy billion-dollar satellites, it's assumed best to leave that sort of thing to the government for some reason, because, us rational, competent, responsible, honorable, effective human beings couldn't possibly do something as complex as the government or NASA, right? Because we know how effective and efficient the government is. And that was sarcasm. So we have a situation where the lies of NASA are theoretically supporting all of the communications industry. However, mega bandwidth fiber optic cables run through every ocean, connecting all the continents. And of course, NASA has a chain of command just like everything else, where the dictates come from the top down. And of course, NASA has the full power and bravado of the media behind them. Einstein rose to the point of superstardom, something which doesn't really make sense, as scientists are typically not like super famous rock stars, and it's not as if Einstein ever really invented anything of worth. I think he did invent some bizarre sort of refrigerator. But other than that, his theories really had no semblance of scientific reality or testability, as the premises involved with his theorem are neither demonstrable, observable, or falsifiable. Thus, Einstein's theories are exactly pseudoscience. The implications of Einstein's theories in everyday life, whether they are remotely true or not, simply don't exist. There is no major change to everyday life thanks to Einstein's theories. People will claim nuclear bombs are a result of his theories somehow, but nuclear bombs don't exist. And I need to do a video on that, but there's plenty of evidence to show that. And I've covered it in several videos, but we'll leave that one alone for now. Nuclear bombs don't exist, nuclear power is a misnomer, and hot atomic fusion is a theoretical fantasy. So that covers sort of all of the nuclear things in a nutshell. Now, it was necessary to present Einstein as the super genius of the century in order to allow for the heliocentric theory to remain hypothetically viable. I would submit that the scientific community of Einstein's era was even less equipped to deal with disingenuous groups of influential scientists backed by, deceptive media. Honest people find it extremely difficult that people they feel close to or people they trust could possibly be slightly dishonest, or even totally dishonest, or God forbid, just absolute deviance. But unfortunately, there are psychotic people in positions of power and influence. That's just the way that it goes. Psychopaths are drawn to positions of power and influence, and it seems through secret brotherhoods like Freemasonry and other things, they're able to sort of find each other and raise each other in ranks. That's the only way I can see the world coming to the state that it's in today, but yet again I digress. The point is, the religion of scientism behaves in such a manner that specific people are deified like Einstein, or specific entities are deified like NASA, in order to raise them above the average person, in order to allow for them to dictate decrees to be followed from the top down, which are then parroted by all the minions of scientism, whether these parrots understand the dictates or not. That's the problem with scientism, is it is a religion that is believed by all of its followers, whether they understand the dictates or doctrines or dogmas or not. Now, the Apollo missions were a little bit different than some of the other forgeries and false flags and things that we've seen throughout history, as the Apollo missions weren't focused around a single individual, as in the case of Einstein, nor did they foment any sort of war, at least directly, nor did the Apollo missions provide the pretext for the dismantling of the Constitution in the case of 9/11, with the Patriot Act and such. Nor did the Apollo missions kick off something like the Vietnam War, like responding to an event that never occurred, as in the case of the Gulf of Tonkin. The Apollo missions were indeed fabricated for the benefit of the government, which is an ultimate singular benefit. And what that is the majority of people believing that the moon is a terra firma spherical object that can be, hopped around on in the void of space, just as we all believed it to be before NASA went. That was the goal of the Apollo missions, and that's why we never went back, because mission was already accomplished. There's no other reason for them to go back to the moon, because they've already proven that the moon is a sphere in space. They did all that to avoid this conversation we're having now, where we all know that the Earth is a stationary plane, and so regardless of what the moon is, it's irrelevant. If the Earth has no curvature and it's not spinning around, then it is the opposite of a spinning sphere, indeed. What's funny is when NASA did go to the moon, even though nobody had ever been there, and I guess Russia had gotten close, they had just never set foot on the moon, but whichever one went first, it's irrelevant. What's funny is the moon was exactly the same size and velocity and distance as theoretical physics had estimated it to be, which is just too exact. I mean, the variables in between our eye and the light from the moon are innumerable, and we can tell from high altitude weather balloon footage that the moon appears to get smaller as you gain in altitude, and I think that has to do with atmospheric lensing, or maybe something else. But the point is that theoretical physicists had estimated the size and distance to the moon, and of course, when that is confirmed to a T, to the umpteenth decimal point, by Roscosmos or NASA, to me that's sort of a dead giveaway, because they should have been off by at least a little bit in every realm. So the moon should have been a little bit bigger or smaller than they expected, or maybe a little bit further or closer than they expected, or maybe a little bit faster or slower than they expected. But no, it was exact as what they had predicted, based on technology that couldn't possibly predict or measure to that accuracy from the ground. So, just the behavior of NASA and how they always seem to confirm the popular theories of the day with their experiments is sort of telling. If you catch my drift, maybe I'm not expressing this right, but I don't know how else to explain it. I guess self-fulfilling prophecies is one good way to put it. So NASA, looks at what the theories are of the day, because the heliocentric model has changed over the years. But whatever the theoretical model was of that time, that's what they went with, and that's what it remains today in terms of the size and distance of the moon. Right. It is rather convenient that the moon turned out to be exactly as large and as fast and as distant as was estimated by astronomers, all of whom would have erroneously assumed the Earth to be a sphere, meaning the moon must be much smaller and closer than they believed. So this proves that NASA was lying yet again, although it's sort of a redundant proof. The problem really is the moon landing footage was obviously faked, and NASA continues to fake all of their spacewalks and their ISS streams using state-of-the-art CGI coupled with plain and simple trick photography 101, including, green screens or chroma keys or simple harnesses which are edited out of the shot using automated technology, along with near real-time insertion of fabricated CGI graphics, possible parabolic trajectory maneuvering aircraft like the Vomit comics simulating an inertially neutral environment or weightlessness for extended periods, possibly if the proper technology was achieved. Another one they faked was the Curiosity stuff from Mars, which they did a big documentary, I think, on Discovery Channel, and I was really into that documentary until I realized it was all CGI. And for the rest of the hour-long program, I couldn't figure out why would they send a rover to Mars, land it successfully, and then make a CGI movie about it when they had cameras on the thing.
The landing team is feeling especially good tonight. In the space of 3 weeks, they've beaten Mars twice.
There's actually 3 things we need to do here. 1, drinks. 2, take a picture. And 3, go together to the press conference.
For 3 years, delivering the rovers safely to Mars has been the focus of their lives. Now their role in the mission is over. Almost. The press room is already packed with reporters waiting to hear from NASA's top officials. But this is an irresistible force. These engineers are now the world's leading experts at landing on Mars. Many of them are already at work on future missions. But this one will be hard to top.
All of us on the EDL team acknowledge that this is the greatest experience of our professional lives. So there's a lot of separation anxiety. That's what we're talking about. You know, how can anything match this?
The answer is they didn't go to Mars and they faked the whole thing. Of course, they do a lot of spacewalks that are shot underwater in pools. You see plenty of shots with air bubbles in space, and NASA even admits that one of their astronauts nearly drowned as a gallon of water entered into his helmet while during a spacewalk in the vacuum of space, and so they had to deploy a makeshift snorkel.
Some drama at NASA now. There will be several spacewalks to attend to a major problem, and this time they're using snorkels while they do it.
When you see the astronauts in the ISS, always smiling, they just love to play with their little 3D animated objects, as if they constantly need to prove to us just how weightless they are. The other day we were watching the future of NASA on the GlobeBusters. We did a special episode on Wednesday past. I'll put a link in the description. But we watched the future of NASA, where they presented their first ever footage of the ISS using 4K cameras. And instead of showing us mind-boggling pictures of the Earth from space or the stars or the moon, they showed us the astronauts playing ping pong with water in space. And that is the future of space. just as any other religion or corporate body or military organization or governmental organization or, like I said, any religion, the religion of scientism or the scientific community has a hierarchy and a chain of command where the initiates or the laymen are basically clueless. I guess you could possibly say these are the undergraduate students. They're basically clueless whether they have some degree of knowledge of natural, realistic science and or theoretical, nonsensical pseudoscience, as well as logically sound, total misinterpretations of natural observations or experiments. To put that in other words, the initiates of scientism are clueless regardless of what they think they know, simply because of all of the misunderstandings that come right along with the heliocentric model, which is absolutely false. Now, this sort of ignorance at the bottom levels of these organizations, these pyramidal, hierarchical organizations, that's how these religions work. That's how the religion of scientism work. That's how the religion of statism works. Fill in the blanks. Getting back to the topic on hand of Polaris, and we did go off on sort of a tangent there, but it's entirely possible that the source lights of all of the stars are stationary sources, and some medium, whether it's physical or non-physical medium, is rotating, thus creating the illusion that the stationary source lights of the stars are describing perpetual circuits overhead. Now, this is, theoretical. I mean, we know that the Earth isn't spinning, so it's either the stars that are spinning or the ether or the magnetic fields that are spinning, but certainly not the Earth. Now, this whole theory or concept may sound far-fetched at first, but when you realize and understand the extent to which light waves can be manipulated or perturbed by magnetic fields, ionized gases, and the varying layers of atmosphere, just to name a few factors or variables, as well as unknown variables that we're not even aware of, it becomes really quite possible that the Earth's natural magnetic fields or its related plasma tubes, along with possible unknown variables, could cause the stars to apparently rotate around Polaris in perfectly concentric circles. Now, in terms of the Earth's natural magnetic field, assuming a flat stationary Earth where Polaris defines the central magnetic North Pole, otherwise called the axis of rotation in globe Earth vernacular, this field would be best described as a central vortex that describes the center of a toroidal-shaped field enveloping up and around all of the flat Earth, where the South Pole is every point along the outer edge of this field. Now notice I didn't say that the South Pole is every point along the outer edge of the Earth. The South Pole is merely every point along the outer edge of the field. The outer periphery of this field would be defined as the South Pole, whether or not the edge of the Earth, cuts off right there, which I doubt, or if the Earth, the plane, continues on past the South Pole, that's unknown at this time. But it does make a lot of sense that you would have this sort of toroidal-shaped field with a magnetic vortex in the center. Now, a magnetic field generated by the massive flat Earth would be so tremendously powerful, it causes compass needles to point towards the north, even in the far southern hemisphere, by the way. That's a pretty powerful magnetic tendency. Now, this apparent rotation of stars overhead, centered around Polaris, is often confused as proof of a rotating Earth, although the observation doesn't match the theory. In one example, precession of the equinoxes could be caused by some slow regression pattern of the magnetic vortex itself, whether the source light of the stars is adherent to the Earth's central magnetic vortex, or the source lights of the stars are essentially fixed to all on a similar plane, where it is the Earth vortex magnetic field that's creating the optical illusion of spinning where the stars only appear to be rotating, This means that the apparent rotation of the stars and the precession of the equinoxes could all be the result of an optical illusion caused by the flow of light through rotating lines of magnetic force, which could act as a conduit or maybe a sort of a path of least resistance for starlight or sunlight or moonlight to propagate through. Now, since light waves are indeed visible frequencies of the electromagnetic spectrum, it's not a huge leap to assume that light waves could conceivably be affected by or adhere to strong magnetic field lines, which run in perpetual vortex pattern, aligned to the center of the Earth, marked by Polaris overhead. Now, these magnetic lines obviously run north to south, or meridionally, which fits nicely to the recent discovery and real-time 3D imaging of plasma tubes in the lower magnetosphere. By the way, my friend Brian gets a nickel every time I mention that phrase, but Cleo Loy, who was an undergraduate student at the University of Sydney in Australia, used the Murchison radio telescope array in a binocular configuration in order to gather real-time 3D animated data, which seems to prove and image the existence of these long theorized tubes of plasma which run north to south, or along meridian lines more or less, which the actual ionized tubes of plasma reside in the lower magnetosphere, or about 350 miles up. Now, the magnetic field lines, which apparently provide the medium for these ionized gases to adhere to and form plasma tubes in the lower magnetosphere, indeed meet with the ground at some point and are nearly perpendicular to the ground when it gets near ground levels, although they invariably are oriented towards the north. Of course, the magnetic field lines near the ground in the troposphere are not able to support ionized plasma tubes, which are strictly found in the lower magnetosphere due to the conditions there. The conditions in the troposphere are obviously much different, but I guess one way to put this would be to say that if anything is curving in terms of space, or apparently curving in terms of space, or apparently curving in terms of the Earth due to our view towards space, I would say that it is the magnetic field that is curving, and possibly these plasma tubes, which, again, plasma is ionized gases or electrically charged gases in the lower magnetosphere. So again, that's about 600 kilometers up, or roughly, around 350 miles or so. Anyway, these magnetic field lines or magnetic flux lines are certainly capable of providing a natural path or a conduit or like a path of least resistance for light waves to travel through. The fact that the Earth's magnetic field is apparently oriented as the center of a toroidal vortex centered above the geographic northern area indicated by the North Pole star Polaris, any inbound light coming from the stars passing through such a strong magnetic field must necessarily be heavily influenced by the rotating matrix of the magnetic field itself. People find it hard to believe that magnetic fields can alter light waves dramatically or even slightly, but indeed magnetic fields can play huge effects on light waves. It seems that the stars could actually be fixed to a single astronomical plane as opposed to like a celestial dome or a celestial sphere, meaning that the illusion of stars which are nearly touching or visually dropping below the horizon is the result of perspective and atmospheric lensing, amongst other variables. But Polaris is unique in the regard that it has never moved from its general location, central to all the other northern stars, ever. Of course, Polaris describes a very small ring over the course of a day, but you can practically say that Polaris is stationary relative to an observer on Earth focused on the general location of the star. Now, the first argument that will typically arise when presented with this factual, observable information involves the sheer distance to Polaris. So people say it's so far away, that's why it never appears to move, thus allowing Polaris to remain apparently stationary regardless of the motion of the Earth, regardless of the motion of the Sun, regardless of the motion of the galaxy. Now, this argument involving the lack of stellar parallax, essentially, due to the alleged distances of the stars, has nothing to do with the issue of Polaris remaining more or less stationary throughout history, as the Earth's alleged motion through space is completely different than theoretical axial precession. Now, according to the heliocentric model, our alleged axis of rotation is in constant flux, slowly phasing through a 26,000-year cycle described as the precession of the Equinoxes. This means that if our theoretical axis was aligned to Polaris, say, 100 years ago, our axis would now be more than 1 degree misaligned to Polaris, where the circle described by the Earth's axial precession represents a 360-degree cycle. In other words, if you assume Polaris to be some 400 plus light years away, amounting to quadrillions of miles, even a small fraction of a degree in divergence of that alignment would knock Polaris out of its whack with its perfectly central position to the other stars. Polaris was central to all the other stars 2,000 years ago, during the time of Hipparchus and Ptolemy, yet we have no historical record or modern record of the North Star changing as it certainly should, according to the heliocentric model in the precession of the Equinoxes. Now, the fact that Polaris remains permanently fixed to a perfectly central point relative to all the other stars, according to any observer in the northern hemisphere, over the course of an evening, over the course of a month, over the course of a year or a decade, doesn't move. You can keep your telescope focused on that general area and you'll still get Polaris every night. This single fact completely falsifies the heliocentric theory due to the observations involved with the precession of the Equinoxes, while Polaris magically remains aligned to the axis, which is physically impossible. Additionally, the alleged angular changes involved with the solar system itself, which is of course orbiting the hypothetical galactic center, renders the possibility of a single, perpetual, unique North Star aligned to our measly, randomly aligned, wobbly axis of rotation for any significant duration is categorically impossible. In order for the North Star to remain central, perfectly aligned to the Earth's hypothetical axis of rotation, the star would need to be radically and arbitrarily traveling through space in order to maintain its perfect alignment with our alleged axis. Now, such astronomical acrobatics are obvious nonsense in either model, which means astronomers must admit that the precession of the equinoxes could not possibly be caused by the Earth's alleged axial precession. So, to summarize all that, the Earth is allegedly traveling in multiple directions at the same time, around varying parabolic curves with varying radii, traveling at varying velocities, including a variety of contradictory accelerations and alignments. For example, the 66.6 degree tilt of the Earth from the ecliptic plane, the 60 degree misalignment of the ecliptic plane from the solar plane or the galactic center, and the alleged velocity of the galaxy itself traveling in a direction contrary to that of the Sun and the Earth, allegedly. Now, our world is claimed to be experiencing constant, unfathomable orbital velocities and theoretical supersonic axial rotation velocities, which render the notion of a central permanent North Pole star categorically impossible, strictly adhering to the accepted mainstream scientific belief and long-term astronomical observation. So, according to the mainstream model of all things, it doesn't work, using their very own values and numbers. The heliocentric theory simply does not allow for a phenomenon such as Polaris, given the wobbling axis of a spherical Earth allegedly orbiting the Sun at a 60-degree angle to the solar plane as the galaxy flies through space-time in a direction divergent from the path of the Sun itself. Polaris's unique ability to remain fixed above the north polar axis of our Earth for all of recorded history, or even for a few dozen years for that matter, is a tremendous, inexplicable observation indeed if you're going to adhere to the heliocentric model. The cosmic acrobatics necessary to allow for the North Star to somehow remain in perfect, perpetual alignment with the Earth's alleged axis of rotation, according to an observer on Earth, even over the course of an evening, presents a problem to the heliocentric theory, since an observer facing north just after sunset will be facing in a completely opposite direction in space just before sunrise. So, pretend you're facing north during right after sunset, and say on the equinox 12 hours later, you're facing north right before sunrise. Well, Polaris, how can Polaris be both of these directions? It doesn't make sense. Now, it would make sense if that observer would have to, change the azimuth and the angle of their telescope to keep Polaris in focus, but they don't. No matter where you are in the northern hemisphere, Polaris remains in that spot. And that very nicely proves, even just over the course of an evening, that the heliocentric model is wrong, if you just think about it a little bit. Furthermore, Polaris will remain in the same point in the sky from season to season as well. So this is also physically impossible according to the heliocentric theory, as an observer facing north in the evening during winter, let's say you've got the sun here in the center, this is the Earth during the winter, the Earth's over here during the summer, and nighttime is obviously going to be that away during the winter and that away during the summer, right? So the fact that even though we're tilted this way, going around the sun this way, the fact that Polaris remains visually central to all the other stars from season to season is quite impossible in the heliocentric model. This is because, again, the observer from winter to summer, standing in the same spot, yet spinning around and orbiting the sun, would be facing in opposite directions from the same vantage point 6 months apart. Now, how is it possible for Polaris to remain central to all the other stars, which form constant, perfectly circular paths concentric to Polaris from season to season, from year to year, decade to decade, century to century, without any change in Polaris's position, in that central position, ever? How is that possible if we are actually orbiting the sun, spinning at an angle to the ecliptic, orbiting the galaxy at a divergent angle from the sun's path, the galaxy, hauling ass through space at a path divergent from the sun's path as well, with our wobbly old axis, as we're told? The short answer is the Earth is not spinning on an axis. It is not a sphere in space. Infinite space doesn't exist, and it is the stars which are apparently rotating overhead over the stationary Earth. That's the simplest answer, and it's actually been proven tons of different ways. Polaris appears to be relatively close, just as all the other stars and celestial lights seem to be relatively close, fixed to a fairly local astronomical plane. Now, this isn't necessarily to say that the celestial lights are physical objects. We simply don't have enough information to definitively prove whether the heavenly luminaries are physical, spherical objects, or just simply mysterious sources of light which are simply perceived to be physical objects in space. One characteristic we can safely theorize or deduce from observing the stars is the fact that the stars appear to be residing more or less along the same plane. This is because, assuming the Earth is flat and stationary, which we know that it is, If the stars were placed at greatly varying distances in terms of altitude above the Earth, then we should see major stellar parallax, as the stars which are lower in altitude would appear to move more quickly through the sky relative to the stars which are positioned much higher in altitude, assuming that they're all rotating at the same rate. Now, the lack of such stellar parallax, which would be very obvious in a flat Earth model where the stars are relatively close, but the lack of this stellar parallax does indicate that the stars are essentially fixed to a similar plane, or at least the medium which diffuses or renders the non-visible spectrum the non-visible spectrum electromagnetic waves into visible spectrum light. That medium may be a plane, whereas the stars may be, the source of those stars may be far removed from whatever that medium is that renders the invisible electromagnetic frequencies into visible light waves. One good example, or sort of a half-assed example, I guess you could say, would be a prism. You shine sunlight through a prism and it diffuses it into the colors of the rainbow. Well, there may be something like that going on overhead, as invisible electromagnetic waves coming from star sources are rendered into the visible spectrum through this medium. That's what I'm saying. Now, the wandering stars, or the planets, may be on varying planes of orbit, as well as the sun and the moon, but the stars themselves certainly appear to be adherent to a similar astral plane. Unfortunately, our misguided educational system has filled our heads with absurd physical laws and theorem, thus repressing our ability to perceive the world around us properly, robbing us of our discernment. And astronomers assume, as a rule, that the stars are practically infinitely distant, which is why we don't experience any very obvious stellar parallax, which should be really quite noticeable over the course of centuries or thousands of years, meaning the constellations should slowly be sort of, misorienting themselves over time, especially given not just stellar parallax because of our motion through space, but because of the whole Big Bang theory and the, rotating galaxy theory. We don't see any changes in the stars' configuration relative to one another ever, which is not good for the heliocentric model, and I don't give a damn how far you theoretically place the stars. Especially when you're dealing with parallax. Especially when you're dealing with Polaris, which we've sort of already covered, we're still covering. We're finishing up with Polaris here in a minute. Now, the nature of perspective, which is a result of how our eyes work, you can look more into that, but the nature of perspective causes stars to appear to drop lower towards the ground or towards the horizon in direct proportion with the lateral distance from the observer. This law of perspective adds to the illusion of Earth curvature, or at least to a curved celestial dome or a curved celestial sphere. Such a celestial dome is a mere optical illusion, which makes perfect sense on a flat Earth, with relatively local stars fixed to a consistent astral plane, where the operation of perspective, atmospheric lensing, magnetic perturbations, and maybe other unknown variables provide the conditions necessary to cause the stars, which are nowhere near the ground, to appear to not only rotate around Polaris, but also in many cases of stars to nearly touch the horizon, and sometimes even appear to dip below the horizon, which, that doesn't actually happen. It's an operation of perspective, coupled with those other factors that I've mentioned, including, again, atmospheric lensing and magnetic perturbations, which provide the necessary conditions to cause the stars to appear to rotate around Polaris and nearly touch the horizon. Now, the fact that Polaris remains stationary and central to all the other stars makes zero sense in terms of the heliocentric hypothesis, for several reasons that I've already mentioned. Now, not only does the operation of perspective create the illusion of a celestial dome, where the most distant stars laterally appear to nearly touch the ground, but the perturbations caused by the atmosphere itself add to the illusion of a celestial dome. In truth, the distant stars, which appear dangerously close to the ground horizon, actually exist upon more or less the same plane as the stars which are 90 degrees overhead from you. Whatever the stars are, is a big mystery, even to modern science, although they will never admit it, as scientists claim to know everything. They claim, of course, that hot atomic fusion is taking place inside of the stars, powering the stars, giving light to the Earth. However, such a process, hot atomic fusion, is merely theoretical. It has never been demonstrated in the slightest degree, and therefore you can't use that as an explanation of what's going on in a star. For one thing, the whole idea of atomic sciences or quantum sciences or particle physics is pseudoscience, I'm sorry to say. Atoms, the building blocks of all matter, the smallest parts of all things, have never been measured or observed. Furthermore, if atoms are the smallest building blocks of matter, then how are they made up of smaller parts? Electrons, protons, neutrons, etc. I'm sorry, but if an atom is made up of lots of things, then it is not the smallest building block of matter. And by the way, what are electrons made of? Yes, I know the scientific explanation of that, but again, this is all theoretical. It's never been demonstrated, never been proven. Now, of course, modern science can manipulate the phenomenon of electricity. We can produce electricity simply by, winding a metallic coil around a magnet and spinning the magnetic coil, or spinning the magnet, generates this thing called electricity. And of course we have theories as to what's going on in there. They're saying it's a transfer of electrons, like a daisy chain transfer of electrons. But in truth, that is just theoretical. And although, we can manipulate electricity, and we have theories as to what's going on, within an electric circuit, if you ask an honest electrical engineer, they will tell you clearly that they really have no idea what's actually going on in the microscopic, ultra microscopic level in an electric circuit. Such a thing will never be imaged. It's theoretically too small. But I don't even think that atoms and electrons and protons and neutrons exist. I think that it is theoretical. Now, of course, you have things like the periodic table of the elements, which shows, atomic weight and the number of electrons and the number of valence electrons. And this is all derived from mathematical descriptions of observable reality. And so, of course, the math is going to work in terms of, chemistry and the formation of molecules by different atoms and such. The numbers work in theory because, frankly, the numbers were crafted around observable reality. So you can't say that the numbers prove the theory of atoms. This is very much the same thing as saying, okay, we observe what goes up must come down. We theorize that it's caused by gravity. Gravity is the mass of the Earth warping space-time, and space-time sort of accelerating things towards the Earth. Again, the observation is what goes up must come down. The theory is gravity. And I'm sorry, but the observation doesn't prove the theory. What goes up must come down is definitely a thing. Gravity is just a theory to explain that thing. And you can't use the original observation to prove the theory, if that makes sense. The same exact thing applies to atomic theory. Right, so sort of wrapping this one up on Polaris, and I know we touched on other things other than Polaris, but, the observation of Polaris over time clearly disagrees and disproves the heliocentric premise, especially in light of things like the precession of the Equinoxes, which I did mention a few times, the fact that we can observe Polaris over the course of an evening in the same place in space, provides some degree of triangulation on Polaris, say during the summer. However, 6 months later, when you're on the opposite end of the sun, and nighttime or visible space is on the opposite end of the sun compared to the previous season I just mentioned 6 months earlier, the fact that Polaris remains fixed above the same spot in space without moving over just 6 months doesn't work in the heliocentric theory. And if you couple that with the fact that precession of the equinoxes apparently is a thing, a very minute change in the equatorial stars during the equinox, about 1 degree every 72 years, which was picked up a couple thousand years ago by Hipparchus and carried on by Ptolemy, who in their combined lifetimes noticed 2 degrees of changes in these stars on the vernal equinox. And of course we should give these guys a little bit more credit and assume that they would have noticed a major 2-degree change in the central North Pole star. And if you fast forward 2,000 years, we should have seen a whopping, more than 25-degree change in terms of the star aligned to our North Polar axis, humoring the heliocentric theory. So the whole thing really falls apart with Polaris, which is why it was number 4 in the top 5 reasons that the heliocentric model is an epic failure. Team Heliocentric 0, Flat Earth 2, because and that's in points. Because again, in order to combat the heliocentric model, we don't have to prove flat Earth, we just have to disprove the heliocentric model. That's how science works. And really the process of elimination is the best way to discern truth by all means. So if the Earth isn't spinning and it's not a sphere, then odds are, well, it can't be a spinning sphere for sure. Odds are it's a stationary plane, which it appears to be by all accounts. So with that being said, if you guys would like to see more videos keep coming, give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe or resubscribe if you've been subscribed and unsubscribed. Just make sure to double check. Ring the bell, check the box that you want notifications so that you won't get unsubscribed. If you'd like to support the channel, first of all, a big shout out to my patrons on Patreon. Appreciate you guys. You can become a patron for as little as $1 per month. And the link to that is www.patreon.com/themorguile. And I've got it set up to where I monetize per video, but I learned that you can actually decide to only opt in for 1 or 2 or however many videos per month that you want to support. So it's not like if I do 5 dozen videos in a month that you have to support all 5 dozen of those, but I wouldn't do that anyway. At any rate, so that's Patreon. You can support the channel directly to the PayPal link, paypal.me/themorguile1, that's the number 1, or direct PayPal transfer to jonelance@gmail.com. I want to give a big shout out and thanks to everybody that's supported this channel through PayPal and Patreon. Love you guys, and if you're unable to support, I understand. Just give the video a big thumbs up and maybe click on one of the sponsor advertisements. So God bless you all. Thanks so much for your time. Thanks for watching. Spread the word, spread the world, and peace.